we will learn about the coverings of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is basically covered by the meninges. The meninges are described in 3 layers. The dura mater, which has 2 layers, then the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. Now on the diagram you can see the cerebral cortex, and the layer that covers it first is the pia mater, then superficial to that you have the arachnoid mater, then the 2 layers of the dura, okay, and then on top you have the skull, which is made out of bone, 2 plates of cortical bone, and in the middle a layer of spongy bone. Then above that you have the scalp, and the scalp is hair bearing. So all of these layers are actually covering the brain. Now let's talk about the different layers in a little bit more detail. If you take the dura mater, as I said, there are 2 layers. We divide them into 2. First one is the endosteal layer, which is periosteal layer of the inner plate of the skull bones. Now I just told you the skull bones, the vault of the skull and also the base, they have several layers. You have cortical bone, then 2 layers of cortical bone, in the middle spongy bone, right? So the endosteal layer of that, the periosteum, forms the endosteal layer of the dura mater. Then below that you get the meningeal layer, which is a strong fibrous layer and covers the brain, and it continues down through the foramen magnum onto the spinal cord, as we learnt in the spinal cord lecture. Now the 2 layers of dura mater are very closely adherent to each other, except where they separate to form the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so some of the dural venous sinuses lie between the 2 dural layers. Now the dura is actually, as I said, dense and strong. It is made mostly out of connective tissue, and it continues through the foramen magnum and continues with the dura mater of the spinal cord. It is the same layer, and it also provides a tubular sheath for the cranial nerves, and later it passes through the foramina in the skull, right? So as the cranial nerves pass through the foramina of the skull, a sheath of dura mater mixes with it, and then it becomes the sheath of the cranial nerves. Then outside of the skull, this sheath fuses with the epineurium of the nerves. Then this dura mater also sends in septa, right? Sends septa into the cranial cavities, dividing the cranial cavity into several spaces. Now the function of these septa is to restrict the displacement of the brain when there's acceleration, deceleration, right? So when you shake your head or move your head, your brain doesn't shake, right? So there's the fluid as well, which also helps in here, but the dural septa which go into the cranial cavity prevents the brain from moving too much inside the cranial cavity. So what are these septa, or these septa that is sent into the cranial cavity? One is the Falx cerebri. Okay, so this has a sickle shape, right? And it is a fold of dura mater. Okay, so the meningeal layer grows downwards, and there's a fold because on either side you get the 2 dura maters folding in. So there are 2 layers. Okay, and it lies in the midline between the 2 cerebral hemispheres. And the Falx cerebri is anteriorly attached to the internal frontal crest and to the crista galli. Okay, and posteriorly it blends in the midline with the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so the Falx anteriorly is attached to the crista galli, posteriorly it continues as the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, and in the margins you find several dural venous sinuses, which we will learn later. Now here in this diagram where the brain has been removed, you can see the different septa which are formed by the folding of the dura mater into the cranial cavity. Right? The sickle shaped or the half moon shaped one is what we just talked about, the falx, right? Falx cerebri. And in the walls of these, between the two layers, you can see the venous sinuses. And then the tent-like area, right? That is the tentorium cerebelli, right? So this you can see clearly that it divides the cranial cavity into compartments, and the lobes are situated in these different compartments. Now talking about the tentorium cerebelli, it is a crescent shaped fold of dura mater that roofs over the posterior cranial fossa. It covers the upper surface of the cerebellum and it supports the occipital lobes, right, of the cerebral hemispheres. In the anterior edge, there is a gap, right, as you saw in the diagram, there is a gap which we call the tentorial notch for the passage of the midbrain. And the fixed border is attached to the posterior clinoid process, the superior border to the petrous bones, and the margins to the grooves of the transverse sinuses on the occipital bone. So if you take a base of skull and examine this, you can see the transverse sinuses, but the impression left by this transverse sinuses. So the tentorium cerebelli, the edge is attached to that groove. Okay, so here you can see that diagram. So you can see the transverse sinuses, and you can see on the edge how the tentorium is attached to it, right? So the straight sinus is there and the transverse sinuses are there, and you can see the notch, the tentorial notch, where the brain stem goes down into the posterior cranial fossa. So it's like a roof over the posterior cranial fossa, and it protects the cerebellum which lies underneath. So that is the name. That the name means a tent over the cerebellum. Okay, so here this is a gross specimen showing you the same details. You can see the different cranial fossa. You can see the falx cerebri rising from the midline and going down, a sickle shape, and then you can see the tent-like tentorium cerebelli. Now the dura mater is supplied by blood vessels as well as nerve fibers. So you get the trigeminal, vagus and the first three spinal nerves. Then it has sensation, right, pain sensation. It is actually sensitive to stretching, right? So people say that most of these headaches are due to stretching of the meninges inside the cranial cavity. And then the middle meningeal artery, branch of the intercarotid, and the maxillary and the vertebral arteries, small branches, will supply the dura mater, right? So the dura mater is sensitive to pain. Now talking about the arachnoid mater, it is actually a very delicate impermeable membrane which covers the brain, and it lies between the pia mater and the dura mater. It is separated from the dura by a potential space which we call the subdural space, right? So there may be a thin film of fluid in this space, and then underneath that it is separated from the pia mater by the subarachnoid space. Okay, so on either side you have actual space which is the subarachnoid space, and subdural space which is a potential space. So the subarachnoid space is the one which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and then the outer and the inner surfaces of the arachnoid are covered by flattened mesothelial cells. Now here you can see a gross specimen showing you the dura mater which has been cut open to form a window, and on the surface you can see the arachnoid matter, which gives it the shiny appearance. Okay, this diagram again shows you the three layers. On more superficial the skull, then you can see the dura mater, the two layers of the dura mater, and you can see that the arachnoid mater is actually adherent to the dura mater, the inner layer of the dura mater, and then you can see the subarachnoid space, which is filled with CSF, right, diagrammatically represented here, and then the surface of the brain is very closely covered by the pia mater, and in the subarachnoid space you will find all the blood vessels, right, mostly the circle of Willis, the branches coming from the carotid and the vertebral artery will be there in the subarachnoid space. Okay, and you can see that there are small extensions or connections between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater which run across the subarachnoid space. Okay, so the subarachnoid space, as I said, arachnoid is connected to the pia mater across the fluid filled subarachnoid space by delicate strands of fibrous tissue. All the cerebral arteries, veins and cranial nerves lie in this space, and the arachnoid fuses with the epineurium of the nerves at the point of exit from the skull, right. So the dura mater and the arachnoid mater all are connected or go with the epineurium of the cranial nerves. Then if you take the optic nerve, which is special, the arachnoid forms a sheath for the nerve and it extends into the orbital cavity, right, through the optic canal, and then it fuses with the sclera of the eyeball. Okay, so remember that there is a connection, that is why there is a very close connection between the eye, the optic nerve and the brain. And the subarachnoid space extends around the optic nerve as far as the wall of the eyeball. So this is really important because pressure inside the cranial cavity can be visualized at the optic nerve. That is why when there's increased pressure, that pressure is seen in the optic cup. When you can't see it, what we call papilledema, because the sharp margin of the cup is lost. The optic disc is lost when there is increased intracerebral pressure. Okay, and that is the reason, because the subarachnoid space continues up to that surrounding the optic nerve. Now talking about the pia mater, this is highly vascular and it is also covered by flattened mesothelial cells, and it closely invests the brain. It covers all the gyri descending into the deeper sulci, right. It is very closely adherent to the brain tissue, and actually you can't remove it off the brain tissue, it's quite difficult, right. And it extends over the cranial nerves and again fuses with the epineurium. So all three layers do that. Then the cerebral arteries entering the substance of the brain has to take a sheath of pia mater with them, because that is a protective layer. Then the pia mater forms the tela choroidea, the roof of the third and the fourth ventricles of the brain, and fuses with the ependyma, which is the epithelium of the brain ventricles, to form the choroid plexus, right. So these are found in the lateral third and fourth ventricles of the brain. Okay, so pia mater, remember, it's very tightly adherent to all the surfaces of the brain, right. The arachnoid mater is adherent to the deep layer of the dura mater, right. So when you dissect, you won't actually be able to see three layers. You will be able to see the dura very clearly and the arachnoid, which is attached to the undersurface of the dura, and on the surface of the brain tissue you can see the pia mater quite clearly because of the shiny appearance, right. So you can try to pick it out and remove it, but it is very closely adherent to the brain substance. Okay, so the dural coverings continue on to the spinal cord. I think I discussed this in detail when we did the spinal cord lecture. So on this you can see that the three meningeal layers and the two spacers actually continue on to the spinal cord. Okay, so here you can see the dura mater, the two layers, then you can see the subdural space. Then you can see the arachnoid mater, right, and then the pia mater, which is closely adherent to the spinal cord as well, and in between you can see the subarachnoid space, and you can see the pia mater forming the denticulate ligaments, right. So we talked about this when we did the spinal cord. Here again you can see the 3 layers, and you can see how the dural coverings actually continue out with the spinal nerves, again merging with the epineurium of the spinal nerves as well. Okay, so here you can see what we call a meningioma, right? I'm sure you know about this. So meningiomas are basically benign tumors which arise in the meninges, formed by the meninges, and they can cause pressure symptoms inside the brain. Sometimes they may appear like even as behavioral changes, right? Especially if it is in the frontal lobe, you can get behavioral changes, and it is a structural problem giving rise to behavioral changes. Okay, so this is what they call the dural tail sign in a meningioma, because the dura gets thickened and it looks as if the tumor actually has a small tail, right? But this is said to be there not only in meningiomas but in other tumors as well, where there's thickening of the dura mater surrounding that area.